My name is Becky Belcore. I am 50 years old, and I was born in Seoul, Korea. I was adopted from Korea when I was 1 year old by parents living in the United States. When I was first adopted from Korea, my parents were living in Minnesota. And at that time, there were more Korean adoptees being adopted into the state of Minnesota than in all the other 49 states combined. So I lived there until I was about 5 years old, and then my father's job changed and we moved to the South. So I mainly grew up in the South, in Virginia, and then later in Alabama. So my parents adopted me and then later, a few years later, my brother from Korea because they believed they could not have biological children of their own. And then, of course, what happened was after they adopted 2 children, then my mother got pregnant. And so I also have a sister who's my parents' biological child. What was interesting about it that they told me later was that they had first tried to adopt a white child, and then they discovered there was an 8-year waiting list to be able to adopt a white child. So then they wanted to adopt a black child because it would be faster. And they were told that they should not adopt a black child because they would never be able to instill a sense of racial pride in the child. And so that's when they learned from another family in Minnesota that they had just adopted from Korea. So they said, oh, well, why don't you do that? You could adopt a Korean child, which I thought was very interesting because they hadn't considered what that meant to adopt a child from Korea, given what they had been told about adopting a black child. In terms of us being adopted from Korea, my parents' attitude towards it was they didn't really want to think about or recognize the fact that we were Korean. So their approach to it was, these are our children. We don't think of them as Korean. Like they would always say that to us. We don't think of you as Korean. We think of you as our children. You're Becky and Brian, our children. You should not worry about being from Korea. You know, we grew up in all-white neighborhoods, going to all-white schools. We were usually the only kids of color in our school. And when other kids would harass us or tease us or even beat us up, when we would come home and talk to our parents about it, that's what they would always say. I mean, they would say, we love you, and that's wrong that happened. But they didn't believe it happened because we were Korean. They just believed that it happened because children are children and that they really wanted us to believe that too. And so I think they tried their best given who they were as white people in this country. They just didn't have any understanding of what it meant to adopt children of color from another country to grow up in this country. Growing up in all-white neighborhoods, in all-white schools was very challenging. I had a lot of self-hatred. I always wished that I was white. I always wished my hair was blonde and that I had blue eyes, and I would go to bed oftentimes at night hoping I'd wake up the next morning and that I would look different. And I couldn't understand why I looked the way I did because especially back at that time in the South, like today it's different. There are a lot more Asian Americans living in the South, especially places like Atlanta or Houston. But back then there were barely any. I never saw really any other Asian people. My brother and I actually talked once that we thought Korea had blown up, that it had been blown up in a war because we never saw anyone else from Korea. So we didn't know what had happened to Korea. And it was before the internet, so you couldn't Google and see where Korea was. And it wasn't until I was probably 14 years old that my mom met a Korean lady somewhere. I don't know how she met her actually, but she came to our house and she had all these Korean fashion magazines. And so she showed them to me and I was shocked. I was shocked that there were these magazines full of, these beautiful Korean people. And so that made me realize, oh, Korea must exist and there must be people from Korea still somewhere. After I went to college and I saw there were other Korean people, so I went to a women's college and my school was actually about 1/6 Korean. And they really wanted to make friends with me. I think they were very curious about meeting a Korean adoptee. And so they invited me to be on the Korean volleyball team, to go to Korean church. But honestly, I was really afraid of them because I didn't really know what it meant to me to be Korean. I didn't even know what being Korean was, and I can't speak Korean. I know anything about Korean culture, so I felt that I would be rejected by them ultimately, and I already had a fear of rejection from growing up as an adoptee and growing up in a white society, and so I actually really avoided them. Like they tried really hard to reach out to me, but I just was polite and said, oh, no, I'm too busy, and so I didn't really make very strong Korean friendships. I mean, I had a couple that I would eat lunch with sometimes, but I didn't get to know any of them that well. But I think what it did start for me, because also in college, it was the first time I took a sociology class, and it was the first time that I started to understand that my life was not just my individual experience, that it had been shaped by a larger system and by systematized racism and sexism and classism. And it helped me understand why my life had turned out the way it had. That led me to be interested in activism and organizing, because I could relate. I was like, oh, okay, so this thing that happened to me actually happens to large groups of people, and that the only way that's going to change is if people act together to make a change for all of us. I became more interested in that kind of organizing work, and then through that I started to meet other people of color. So I've heard this from other adoptees, there's sort of a gradual process in getting to the Korean community, if that's the route that you choose, where it can start with, first you start hanging out with other people of color because you have that shared experience. Then it may be that you start to hang out with other Asian Americans because there's a even more closer shared experience, and ultimately you may get to the Korean community, which is your own ethnicity, because of the fear of rejection that you have by being rejected by your own people, that it might take some time. And so that was the path that I took. I first, in college, started to hang out with a group of women of color who were opposed to the Iraq War, and we did some organizing and protesting around that. One of them started to ask me, why haven't you explored your Korean identity? And so then I went off into the labor movement and became a union organizer. And that's when I started to hang out with other Asian Americans, other Asian American organizers, joining APALA, the Asian Pacific American Labor Alliance, and getting to know them. But it wasn't until I came to Chicago in 1996 that there was a friend of mine who was biracial Korean American that I had met through the labor movement. And she said, oh, I know of this place called the Korean American Resource and Cultural Center, and they offer classes that we could take. So they have classes in Korean language, Korean drumming, Korean social issues. There's 4 classes you could take a week. So we signed up for all 4. And so every day after work, I would go to KRCC and take these classes with her. It was my first exposure to Korean people and Korean culture. I felt very overwhelmed by it. And so I remember every night after we would go to class, we would go out to a bar and debrief it and drink some and just try to process it. And it was also interesting because she's biracial Korean American, so her mom is Korean, but then they would assume she knew less about Korean culture because of how she looked, and that I knew more because of how I looked. But it was actually the opposite, because I was an adoptee and her mom was Korean. And so it took a while, honestly, to get used to that space. And I'm not sure I would have stayed in it if I hadn't discovered that they had a social justice lens and component of their work. That really inspired me to try to stay longer, because I struggled with my own identity, because I was learning of, here's what it means to be Korean. And so I thought I had to fit into that. I thought I had to really learn Korean language. I had to act in these certain ways and do these certain things. And it just didn't feel authentic to me. And then I felt, oh, I'm a really bad Korean person, because this feels somewhat oppressive and it doesn't feel good. I mean, some of it felt really good. Some of it I really enjoyed and embraced, and other parts of it just didn't feel natural. And so I struggled a lot with, how do I incorporate all of this together, and how can I really be myself? And so I had been really, really fortunate, because I had studied the civil rights movement in college and written my senior thesis around it. One of the people I studied, his name was Curtis Muhammad, and he had been one of the original members of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC. So on one of my first union campaigns, he was actually an organizer on it. And when I met him, I felt like I'd met a famous person. To me, it's like meeting a movie star. I couldn't believe it, and I couldn't believe that he would take the time to talk with me. He eventually became my mentor. And so when I was struggling at KRCC around whether I should stay there or not, or whether I should continue this journey of exploring my Korean identity, he told me about a time that he had gone to Africa, and that because of the history of slavery in this country and the mixing that had happened because of that, that he'd be walking down the street, and sometimes some of the folks there would yell out at him, "Oh, white man," even though he didn't look white at all. By our standards, but because of the mixing to the folks there in Liberia, they would yell that at him. And so he said what he learned from that is that as people who are part of a diaspora, that we have a right to claim who we are as people of that diaspora and to claim our own experience, that there isn't just one single African American experience, or there's not one single Korean American experience. That even though my experience might not represent the mainstream of the Korean American experience here, that is still a significant and important experience, and that it's my own, and that I can claim that, and then I can share that with my community. So I had the responsibility to go to the community and say, this is who I am as a member of the Korean diaspora, and to learn from them who they are, and then to work together to integrate it all together. Because of that lesson that he taught me, then I decided to stay and to try to figure it out, and try to figure out who am I as a Korean American, as a Korean adoptee in the Korean American community. So after meeting KRCC, I've actually been involved with the organization for 26 years now. I kind of went in and out in terms of different sorts of roles, and I became a board member of our national organization, NAKASEC, and then I ended up becoming the co-director about 6 years ago. So I think when I think of my own identity today, I just identify strongly as a Korean American adoptee and as a member of the Korean American community, because of that journey where it took time, but just figuring out who I was and how my experience fits into the larger Korean American story of who we all are, and that, we all have our individual experiences. We also have our experiences based on our generation or how we came to the United States, that it all blends together to make one story. A lot of times people think of our community as a monolith, that we are all the same, but there's actually a lot of diversity in our community because of the different ways that we all ended up here, and some of us that were born here even. So I think that's how I think of my own identity now. My name is Becky Belcore, and this is my Korean American story.